गुड मॉर्निंग स्टुडंट्स. बायोलॉजीच्या ह्या थर्ड लेक्चरमध्ये तुमचं सगळ्यांचं स्वागत आहे. मागच्या लेक्चरला आपण जे काही शिकलो त्याच्या नोट्स तुम्ही प्रिपेअर केल्याच असतील. आज आपण नेक्स्ट जो काही टॉपिक आहे तो स्टार्ट करणार आहोत. पॉलिनेशन. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma, either of same flower or by different flowers. So in this diagram, you can see it is the complete flower which is having sepals, petals, androecium and gynoecium. So this anther is producing pollen grain. Pollen grains are depositing from one flower to another flower, not only from one flower to another flower, but from the anther to the stigma. It may be deposited on the same plant, or these anthers may be transferred to the stigma of another flower. Okay, so pollination, it is the pollination, transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma, either of the same plant, either of the same flower, or of different flower. Pollen grains being non-motile, angiosperms have evolved the strategy to use abiotic agents like wind and water and biotic agents like birds, insects, snails to their flowers, feeding the visitors and exploiting their mobility for pollination and also seed dispersal. Pollen grains are non-motile and they are usually carried from flower to flower by means of external agents. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower. Just now I told you. It is the prerequisite for fertilization because both the male and female gametes are non-motile. Moreover, gametes are produced at two different sites. So, in this paragraph, it is said that as the pollen grains are non-motile, means if they will be motile, then they can move by themselves. But in these angiosperms or any flowering plants, the pollen grains are non-motile, and hence in that angiospermic plant there are some strategy. They evolved, means they developed some strategies to use the biotic agents or abiotic agents. Abiotic agents, you can understand, those agents which do not have life, like water or wind. They are physical factors, and biotic agents can be also the cause to transfer the pollen grains from one flower to another flower. So biotic agents may be birds, insects, or snails to their flowers. What are the another aspects? Feeding the visitors. Feeding the visitors means the pollen grains, by this process of pollination, not only the pollen grains are transferred from the anther to stigma, but the another purpose is to feed that insects, to feed the visitors, either it may be bird or insect or snails. By producing nectar, these flowers feed that insects or visitors, whatever it may be bird, insect, or snail, or any other bat, like that. Also, one more cause is they are exploiting their mobility for pollination. Means that feeding visitors are having mobility, they can move. You know that all these things, all these biotic agents like birds, insects, snails are having power of mobility. So these insects exploit means they expose or they utilize their power of mobility for the process of pollination and also seed dispersal. Means in this paragraph four purposes are there. Four purposes of pollination. First purpose, as the pollen grains are non-motile, the angiosperms are having some strategies. So these strategies are by using abiotic and biotic agents. Second, feeding the visitors, means whatever the insect, bird will visit that flower, definitely that flower will give nectar to that visitor. Next, they exploit their mobility, means these biotic components utilize their power of mobility for pollination. And fourth, also seed dispersal. They can disperse the seeds of these flowers from one place to another. Pollen grains are non-motile and they are usually carried from flower to flower by means of external agents. Huh. So, because that pollen grains do not have any ability to move as they are non-motile, they are usually carried, means they are dispersed from one flower to another flower by using some external agents, and these external agents may be biotic or abiotic. Okay. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the flower. It is prerequisite for the fertilization process because prerequisite for fertilization because both the male and female gametes are non-motile. Okay, we already discussed this. Means it is pre-decided process. Fertilization because to enhance to um, complete the process of fertilization, pollination is important, and without pollination that pollen grains will not move from anther to stigma as they are non-motile. So moreover, gametes are produced at two different sites. Means all the discussion why this is why all this is there, because the production of pollen grains and the production of stigma are at two different sites. Okay, you know that production of pollen grains takes place at anther, and pollen germination takes place at stigma. Okay. Self pollination is a type of pollination which occurs in single flower or two flowers on the single plant. It results in inbreeding or selfing. In contrast to cross pollination, it is the transfer of pollen grains from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of different plants of same species. Pollination can be further divided into three types on the basis of source of pollination. Okay, so we already discussed autogamy, geitonogamy, or self pollination, cross pollination. You can differentiate in between these two types of pollination. Self pollination, which occurs in the single flower. In this diagram, it is shown that the pollen grains are produced at the anther and they are depositing on the stigma of the same flower. It is called as self pollination. And when these pollen grains of anther of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower, then it is called as cross pollination. So, self pollination is the type of pollination which occurs in the single flower or the two flowers of the single plant. It is called as self pollination. It may be called as inbreeding or selfing. Okay. Now, in contrast, means it is opposite to that of the cross pollination. Self pollination is exactly opposite to cross pollination. It is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of different plants. Okay, but they belong to the same species. So pollination can be further divided into three types. Like see, autogamy means self pollination. It is the, now see carefully in this diagram, it is very simple diagram in which self pollination is shown. So it is the type of pollination in which bisexual flower means is pollinated by its own pollen grains. Offsprings are genetically identical to their parents. For example, pea. In case of Pisum sativum, the scientific name of pea is Pisum sativum. So, self pollination is possible when only when the flower is bisexual. This means that for self pollination, that flower should be complete flower. What do you mean by complete flower? When all four floral whorls are present, that is calyx, corolla, androecium, gynoecium. Okay, both androecium and gynoecium should be there. Male as well as female reproductive whorls should present at that flower. So it is the type of pollination in which bisexual flower is pollinated by its own pollen grains. The pollen grains produced at the anther are deposited on the stigma of the same flower. That is called as self-pollination. That is autogamy. You should remember this word auto. Auto means self. Auto. Gamos means marriage. So autogamy. Hmm? the result of this type of pollination is the offsprings are genetically identical, means same morphologically and genetically same like their parents exactly. For example, P. Now second is the gytenogamy. What is gytenogamy? Hmm? Now see carefully in this diagram what is shown. It is the transfer of pollen grain to the stigma of a different flower produced on the same plant. It is functionally similar to cross pollination as it involves pollinating agents, but it cannot bring about genetic variations and it is only of ecological significance. For example, Cucurbita maxima. It is similar to the ontogamy as pollen grains come from same plant. See here, the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of two different flowers, means these are the two different flowers which are produced on the same plant. It is functionally similar to cross pollination. Okay, in the definition of cross pollination we discussed the same point. It is functionally similar to the cross pollination because it involves the pollinating agents, means some pollinating agents are required for the transfer of pollen grains from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. That agents may be biotic or abiotic, but it can bring about genetic variations. Some chances are there of genetic variation. Unlike this, here the offsprings are genetically identical, means same, but here there are some chances of genetic variation as and it is only of ecological significance, means it is not time consuming or some external agents are not required. That's why it is the ecological so significance, ecologically significant process. For example, cucurbita maximum means काकडी वर्गीय जे असतात सगळे ते cucurbita. It is similar to the ontogamy. Ontogamy is same. In the further slide we'll discuss. Now next is the xenogamy, means cross pollination, completely cross pollination or outbreeding. It is the type of cross pollination when pollen grain of one flower is deposited on the stigma of a flower of different plant. You should underline this, different plant belonging to the same species. Again, plants are different but they should belong to the same species with the help of pollinating agency. Means for xenogamy, pollinating agents are compulsory. Without that agents, pollination cannot be possible. So it generates genetically varied offspring. See here, two different plants are there but they are belonging to the same species. Okay, the type for pollination when the pollen grains of one flower is deposited on the stigma of another flower and that flower is produced on the different plants. So two plants are totally different but they should belong to the same species and hence there is the pollinating agents are required. Now majority of flowering plants depend on the transfer of pollen grains, means so many plants are dependent on some depend on transfer of pollen grains. Without transfer of pollen grains, they cannot reproduce. Virtually all seed plants need to be pollinated. Means all seed producing plants uh, are seed producing plants cannot be pollinated without agents. So most of the food and fiber crops grown without the world depend on pollinators for reproduction. All over the world, whatever the food and fiber crops, they are dependent on pollinators for their reproduction. See here, in the same diagram, you can see self and cross pollination. Here it is the stigma, and when the anther whatever the pollen grains produced at the anther are deposited on the stigma of another plant by insects, then it is called as cross pollination, which is xenogamy. When the pollen grains produced at the anther are deposited on the stigma of another flower which are produced on the same plant, then it is called as self pollination but autogamy. And autogamy, sorry, when the anther, when the pollen grains are deposited at the stigma of the same flower, then it is self pollination, that is autogamy. And when the pollen grains produced at the anther of one flower is deposited on the stigma of another flower, then it is the gytenogamy. So it is the difference in between autogamy and gytenogamy. Okay, you know what is anther, stigma, and flower. Next, see the agents responsible pollination. The agents responsible for pollination have been grouped into two main categories, that is biotic and abiotic agents. What is abiotic agents? They are non-living agents like wind and water. So abiotic agents, these are non-living agents which include wind and water. So first type, pollination by wind. Always remember, pollination by wind is called as anemophily. Most of the important crop plants are wind pollinated. This includes wheat, rice, corn, rye is same like wheat, barley, oats, etc. Palms are also wind pollinated. Uh, Always remember what is anemophily. Anemophily is the type of pollination in which transfer of pollen grains from anther to stigma takes place by wind. वाऱ्यामार्फत जेव्हा पोलन ग्रेन्स वाहून जातात एका फ्लॉवरच्या अँथर पासून तर स्टिग्मा पर्यंत. So to enhance this process, that particular flowers are adapted for this type of pollination, that is anemophily. First, the flowers are small, inconspicuous, colorless, without nectar and fragrance. What is the first adaptation? Flowers are small, इनकॉन्स्पिक्युअस मीन्स दे आर नॉट अट्रॅक्टिव्ह, कलरलेस, विदाउट नेक्टर अँड फ्रॅग्रन्स. कारण असंही त्यांना वाऱ्यानेच वाहून जायचं, त्याच्यामुळे फार अट्रॅक्टिव्ह फ्लॉवर्स प्रोड्यूस नाही होत. द पोलन ग्रेन्स आर लाईट इन वेट, ड्राय अँड प्रोड्यूस इन लार्ज नंबर्स टू इन्क्रीज चान्सेस ऑफ पॉलिनेशन कन्सिडरिंग वेस्टेज ऑफ पोलन ग्रेन्स. मीन्स बेसिकली द नंबर ऑफ पोलन ग्रेन्स आर मोर. फॉर एक्झाम्पल, if 100 pollen grains are produced, if 100 pollen grains are produced over here, then out of that, not 100 but only 50% to 30 to 50% will be successful at pollination. That's why already the number is more, more large number is there, and that's why pollination is considerable amount. Then there is a consideration of some wastage of pollen grains. Then stigma is feathery to trap pollens carried by wind currents. So their stigma is feathery, so that when the pollen grain will deposit at the stigma, then it is trapped over there. Stamens are exerted with long filaments and versatile anther. The stamens of such flowers are having long filament and versatile anther. Versatile anther means what? That anther is loosely attached at their filament. Stamens and stigmas are exposed to air currents. As the air currents flows, the movements takes place. Okay. Second, pollination by water, hydrophily. Okay. So we'll discuss this in the next lecture. Okay. Thank you.